hear us. And it's lovely to be here again. And I was working with four graduate students in my last class from Dadaab, and they were attempting to teach me Somali. And so I have a few phrases, and maybe Galab Wanaksan is one that I can try now. I hope that makes sense, maybe not. Um, it's lovely to see you, and I'm really happy to be here. And I hope in the next hour that we get a chance to also sort of spend a bit of time thinking about the assignment and various other things as well. And forgive me, Roxy, I got carried away there.
Go for it.
I hope all is well. I hope schools are good. I hope you've had a lovely week teaching. I also hope throughout the course that we can really sort of start to build on these school experiences, and we can talk about them. And perhaps this first assignment is an ideal example of that. The clips, I suppose, were really seen as being something to get you thinking about these curriculum. And I think Mark and Ochan, thank you for everything. I think Mark just mentioned the Jason, I think it was Karis Taylor. And there it's so hard. I mean, it's to think through the explicit, the implicit, and the null curriculum. I think the last time Roxy and I were talking about that, the implicit curriculum we thought of it in terms of access, because it's underwater, it's not easy to get to, it's remote, it requires some form of fee to go there. So we wondered if there was a factor there in the implicit curriculum that it was, in a sense, sort of slightly elitist, only allowing some to have the experience of the underwater museum. The explicit curriculum, I think, was always associated with, I suppose, the environmentalism and the idea of representations of human being underwater and being vulnerable to and being, in a sense, colonized by the organic life that lives underwater. But anyway, I think that was. I hope I haven't done what people were going to do, but I think we were going to start with a quick feedback to give us some sense. Roxy, is going to hand over to you. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. So you just did a series of activities over there. Mark, you started us on the feedback piece, but maybe I'll call you back. We want to start all of our sessions in this course by hearing a bit from each of you, about how your activities went and kind of key questions or ideas and insights that emerged. So today we're going to ask Mark to do that report back. And then starting next week, we're going to ask one of you students to come and present back to Steve and I at the beginning of our Zoom session together about your activities before the call.
Thank you. This is not. I mean, it's not an assess piece. It's not a test at all. It's really just to give us an idea of what's happening or what's happened, ideally over the last 2 hours, and hopefully we can try to build that into what we're doing here. In some respects, I suppose the approach we're taking to these courses is more like this sort of quite trendy term at the moment called a flipped classroom. And a flipped classroom, I suppose, is where you have is where thank you is where forgive me it's where you prepare students for the classroom. So you think much more about how can I prepare students for a classroom in advance of that classroom, rather than perhaps the normal way, which is where the classroom becomes the primary vehicle for the delivery of content. And this has become a very kind of like influential way of thinking about this. I've been working with a number of engineer educators in the last week, and everybody's been talking about the flipped classroom and how important it is. But anyway, forgive me, Roxy.
No, it's helpful. So yeah, Mark, I don't know if you would mind, Mark and Ochan, coming back on screen here and sharing with us a bit about how the activities went, with particular attention if there was any kind of main questions or things that were unclear, or any really interesting ideas that came up?
Okay, we played the videos, and we asked the students to explain what they have seen from the videos in connection to the curricula, explicit, null, and hidden. And we found out that they understand very well what is explicit, because it is kind of learning that as teachers, they know that that is what they are demanding from in the school. But we realized that they mix the understanding, the idea between hidden and null. That's a problem for them, because they do not know exactly, even though in the first video that we explained, you know, they saw it was explained. The null curriculum deals with the ideology in such a way that, for instance, the narrator was speaking or talking about the history of North America, where they would be talking about the founder of the America as the people who played a great role in establishment of the American nation. But then, while ignoring these other people like the slaves and people down there, they are not seen. Their voices are not heard. They are not even seen. So, in other words, we explain to them in connection to the Kenyan history, where in Kenya people struggle and fought for Mau Mau. So they are what they call the Kapenguria Six. So these are the people who are considered like the people who struggled for the independence of Kenya. But yet we see down there are a lot of people who fought in the Mau Mau. They have been ignored, and up to now they are still crying. Their lands have even been uh, uh, removed from them. They have been thrown as squatters. So we gave them that idea that this is what we talk of as null curriculum. They are not mentioned at all, yes, and dropped down there. So this is the kind of idea you should know. Something not mentioned, but hidden is the kind of curriculum that the school tries to put forth, but in a situation that with time the student develops and it becomes a part of the student after leaving school, like discipline, like punctuality, and things to do with such kind of things that it is not exactly within the explicit curriculum as is assessed. A teacher is assessed on. Yes. There is no way that you'll be assessed on punctuality of the student or discipline of the student, but still you have to do it and ensure that the school is disciplined. Thank you. As Professor Steve and Roxy, those are the kind of things that they came out with. I think you will explain much more than what I've done so that they get the whole of it. Thank you so much. Welcome.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Yeah, in addition to that, when we are trying to give them the second and the third video, plus the pictures which have been posted, they could not differentiate between which one is playing about the explicit or which part, which scene is talking about the null or the hidden. So the last two short videos had some complications for understanding how they should narrate, how they should explain exactly which part of which scene is talking about this type of curriculum.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good report back.
Yeah, well, Roxy, well, thank you. Yeah, it is. Thank you so much, and thank you so much for talking about these things. And it's a place to start our conversations, I think. And we wanted a way of opening up classrooms to begin to think of ways of analyzing them and grouping various different things together. And that's partly what this activity does. I think Roxy and I have a series of slides that we were going to talk through, and hopefully we can pick up on these questions and explore them. But it's lovely to see you, and I hope the next hour is useful. Remember, the course forum is there. If you have any outstanding questions, please put those up in the course forum and we can talk about them. Similarly, I really want to encourage you to do those introductions, to load up a picture of yourself, and also to say a few words. Indeed, ideally, I'd love you to introduce yourself or to comment on some of the students in Toronto who've also done those introductions. I would really love you to do that. I really want you to do that. And so if that's possible, please let me know if it's not, but I would really love that. So thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Shall I? Do you want me to go? Then you go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Roxy. Never invite a professor on. He just talks. Stop talking, Steve. I suppose the next one is good. Yeah. Thank you. Part of what we're doing to step back for a small moment is to try to explore the distinctions and the connections between place and learning. And I'm not going to dwell on this too much, but throughout this course, we're trying to combine those together. In some ways, we can learn to be in a place. In some way, we can place our learning. And those two parts, I think, are very much part of this sort of conversation. I suppose in the background article, which we put up last time, and we weren't expecting you to read it, but it is there. I turned to Elizabeth Ellsworth, and she wrote this book called Places of Learning. And here she thought about media, architecture, and teaching or pedagogy. And I just came up with this quotation as a way of starting some conversations and thinking about place and learning. And then I guess we'll dive much more into the Eisner article. Place of Learning, she writes about the book, explores what it might mean, to think of pedagogy not in relation to knowledge as a thing made, but to knowledge in the making, by focusing on the means and conditions, the environments and the events of knowledge in the making. It opens up an exploration into the experience of the learning self. What Ellsworth is getting at here and is trying to think through that just the idea of placing learning starts to open up some of the conversations that we think about knowledge. Her invitation is to think of knowledge as a process of knowing, rather than knowledge as something that is done, that is static, that is somehow stored somewhere in the mind. She invites us always to think of things actively, rather than thinking of things passively. To think of learning as being something along the lines of an encounter between this idea of the learning self and the idea of the thing that you're trying to learn. The learning self for her is something that is very central, and she sees that as something to do with experience, something to do with knowledge, something to do or knowing, and something to do with the sensory. The learning self is so central to her way of thinking. But what I like here, and I really encourage you to hold on to, is this idea of always something in the making, the idea in always something that is happening. And we need to attend much more closely to learning processes or knowing, the acts of knowing, rather than the idea of knowledge. It matters. And that's interesting because in some respects, Eisner presents us with quite a static classroom, quite a static school. The school seems almost to be decided before the events have even started. And so Eisner and Ellsworth, I suspect, would have an interesting conversation in which Eisner would stress the structure of the schools determining what occurs, where Ellsworth would want us to think about the moment by moment, how everything is made. Ellsworth allows us to see things perhaps in ways that enable change, whereas Eisner, I think, maybe focuses so heavily on the structure. It's different to imagine a classroom going in a different way than the structure of intending. But anyway, thank you. Oh yes, this one. And I have to be conscious of our time, Roxy, a little bit, because I know we want to spend time on the Eisner. I wanted to sort of talk about how to read an article, and I know that seems very, very silly because everybody is reading. And I also recognize, of course, one of the real hard things about this course is that you're reading in another language, a second, a third language, a fourth language in some cases, and I do completely and absolutely respect that, and I think you're fantastic, because my main language is English, and outside of that, I really don't have a second language that is very strong. Reading education is really weird, and it took me a long time to be able to read it. And every article we give you, I think you can use this for, and I think you can use it for all the other educational courses. I break down reading, I suppose, into 4 different areas, and maybe as we go through this, we can talk Eisner, if that makes sense, Roxy. The first one is to try to think of the big picture. So whenever I get an educational article, I think to myself, well, what is the big picture? And in every educational article we give you, there will probably only be 1 or 2, perhaps maybe up to 4 moves. Every talk I've ever given and every article I've ever written has only had 3 big moves in it. Indeed, there are some articles that I really like that have 1 move in them. Now, those big moves are something to hold on to. It's, if you like, it's the logic of the article. And they can become disguised because there are lots of examples, there's lots of sentences, there's lots of lovely phrases. But underneath every educational article, there's these 1 or 2 moves. In the Eisner article, I suppose the big move, if you like, is Eisner's position that schools teach much more than they advertise. That schools teach much more than the ways in which they are often represented. And Eisner then starts to open that up in terms of this way of categorizing what schools teach in terms of this notion of curriculum. This is a curriculum study. And so Eisner is thinking of the school in terms of the curriculum and seeking to make sense of it by gathering it together into 3 different areas, into 3 different boxes: the explicit, the implicit, and the null. The explicit is almost the intended curriculum. The implicit, if you like, is what happens in the processes. It's not what you do, it's the way that you do it, is a phrase that sometimes reminds me of the implicit curriculum. And the null curriculum is almost what you don't do. Eisner's invitation is not to see schools as inevitable, but to see schools as marks so lovely, so carefully thought through, that have a history. They have a history regarding what's in them and what isn't in them. And that history is not just, this is what you need to know and this is the most efficient thing. That is a history that is involved in terms of world history, in terms of the past, and schools have origins. So those are some of the ways of thinking about it, and maybe we will. I don't know if we want to say any more about the explicit, the implicit, and the null, or maybe we pick that up at some point a little bit later. The other one is, and I'm going to do the next 3 perhaps slightly more quickly. The big one is the moves. Every article, think of it, what are the moves? Can I think of the 2 moves? Can I think of the 3 moves? Those are what you need to put on. The other one is, what are the examples in your writing? And Eisner always thinks of lots of examples to illustrate the moves. The article is jam-packed full of examples, whether those are examples of particular poems by E. Cummings, or whether those are examples of particular quotations by Mumford and Illich, or whether those are, if you like, examples of ideas of compliance, and are examples to do with the ways in which Eisner thinks about these things. So Eisner used lots of examples, and when I read something, I think, that's a really nice example that relates to what I'm doing. I'm going to use that particular example. So I gather examples together. And when I read something, I will often underline the text and think to myself, yeah, that's a really interesting point. That's a point. So remember, big moves and examples of the moves. The other thing I think about is how the person writes. I actually I like Eisner as a writer. I think this article is a little bit long. I think if I was Eisner's editor, I would say, come on, you overquote here. I don't think you need those large quotations. And I think maybe you could have made the article smaller, but I do love some of the phrases, and I love the way that Eisner describes. And I also think, how can I write a little bit like Eisner? How can I think about the ways in which Eisner is able to bring in his own experiences? He's able to write about something in a way that seems very, very approachable, but is actually rather thoughtful. And he's able to bring together a particular argument. And then the last one is perhaps more difficult, but it's something that Mark and Ochan were touching on. And that was Eisner writes from a particular perspective. One of the things about educational writing, it's sometimes as much to do with what you don't say rather than what you do say. And Eisner is able to hold an argument together in a way that it's so persuasive, and it takes you along, and it takes you along in different ways. But of course, there are different ways of thinking. Eisner does some things and doesn't do other things. Eisner has certain values in his own writing. Indeed, Eisner almost has a hidden curriculum, as we all do as writers, and as we all do as educators, things that we don't attend to and things that we don't have time to attend to. And we carry with us our own particular ways of thinking, our own particular ways of thinking about schools. And so Eisner, as Mark so rightly said, has a kind of US value here that goes through. He speaks about schools in particular ways to do with his particular origins, or his particular readings and his particular writings. And of course, when you have read a lot of education research, you can turn to the back of the article and look at the references, and then you have a rough idea of how Eisner, or how the person is writing about. Eisner is not an environmental educator. An environmental educator would be quite different. But Eisner offers an interesting insight into the classroom, and this way of chopping up the explicit, the implicit, and the null, I think is quite helpful in thinking about one's own teaching and one's own practice. So I'll hand to you, Roxy, if you want to the next slide. Do you want to? Yeah.
Yeah, maybe we'll spend a few minutes on that, on this next one. All of this leading into the first assignment. So we can think about Eisner's 3 curricula in a lot of places. We picked 3 images here that we can perhaps speak to a little bit, where we can unpack the different curricula. So this isn't just a thing that we can do for classrooms, but indeed an analysis that we can take on for any space where learning happens, and perhaps arguably just any place in general. Each place has its own assumptions and its own structure that teaches things. So perhaps I will take on this first example, and then we can do the other 2 together and see what comes up as a class. So this first one, the first image on the top left here, is a picture of a university classroom. So quite similar to how you are all sitting right now. There is a big screen at the front where Steve and I are in this slideshow, and the teacher is at the front of the room, and she is teaching a classroom full of people that are sitting in chairs facing one direction. I notice that these chairs can't move, so students are always facing in the same direction. And I notice that students aren't facing each other, but they're facing the teacher. So if we go through the 3 curriculum, perhaps we have to use our imagination a bit. We don't know what the class is that she's teaching, but let's just take an example, and let's say it's a history class. Let's say they're learning, as Mark used the example, let's say they're learning the history of Kenya in this classroom. So if we think about what's the explicit curriculum, you all were doing very well with this one before, so I'm sure you know the explicit curriculum in a history class is history, right? All the students come, that what is advertised in the classroom is, when you come into this classroom, you're going to learn the history of Kenya. So that's the explicit curriculum. It's what's stated, what's obvious. Then we move on to the implicit curriculum. or as Mark called it, the hidden curriculum. So these are the things that are being taught by all of those elements that I noticed before. So perhaps I could say that when the teacher is standing at the front of the room and all the students are simply facing the teacher, this gives a implicit curriculum teaching that the teacher holds the knowledge and that the students are there to learn knowledge from the teacher, right? So what's that also saying is that knowledge is something that you learn and that you absorb, something you memorize. It's not necessarily something that you interact with, as Ellsworth was arguing at the beginning of this slideshow. What we could also notice in the implicit curriculum here is that students are not meant to talk to each other. They're not meant to interact. Their chairs only face in one direction. Again, making the hidden or implicit argument that knowledge happens through teachers. It doesn't happen through discussion. That learning doesn't happen when you interact with students, other students, but it happens again with memorization from the front of the room. This also kind of imposes a certain authority. It teaches that teachers have a certain authority that students are supposed to look up to, they're supposed to respect, right? There's something about this teacher at the front of the room that makes us pay attention to her and not to the back of the classroom. There are many other ones that we could pull up, but I will move on. And we could also look at the null curriculum. And this one is, again, it's perhaps a little bit more simple than it seems, because null just means nothing. It means what you're not learning. So if we're looking at a history class on Kenya, we know that we're not learning the history of Tanzania. We're not learning the history of Europe. We're not learning the history of Canada. We're just learning the history of Kenya. Perhaps if we knew more about what this teacher was teaching, we would learn that she's teaching certain elements of history and leaving out others. What characters, what historical figures are featured in her curriculum and who is left out? As Mark was telling us the history of Kenya, often certain important people are left out of the story. And if they're not included in the curriculum, then we could label them as null. They're not included. Null, nothing. So that's, we can take one small picture and apply these three curricula to it.
And yeah, thank you. Fantastic. I mean, and in the null curriculum, the other piece that Eisner does is he not only talks about the content, but he also talks about, if you like, the intellectual processes. Mm-hmm. And so he might ask the question: are the students, in a sense, factually learning history in a rational sense? Or are they engaging with the dilemmas and with the emotions of those who were involved in that history? Are they presenting history in a very cognitive sense? Or are they seeking to recognize the dilemmas and to feel the weight of history and to sense history in a very much emotional sense? And so maybe the null curriculum is that in this instance is perhaps I'm making it up, a very factual, a very sort of teacher-led class in which history is presented as a series of events, perhaps rather than a way of thinking about history that invites us to engage with it in terms of a series of emotional and a series of embodied ways of engaging with history. So Eisner in the null curriculum thinks not only in terms of content, but also in terms of intellectual processes, provides us with lots of examples. And Eisner also, of course, invites us to think about null not as absent-minded or just missing, but as more purposefully taking a choice. The curriculum has chosen, sometimes through teachers, sometimes through curriculum, sometimes through history, to move in a particular way. It's not arbitrary. It's something that invites us to think about why this has happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Steve. Yeah, and I suppose perhaps we have a few minutes to try our hands at one of these other images. Yeah, perhaps we can take this second one here. So on the top right as well, we have an image of a prison. We have a prisoner and we have guards behind a heavy fence. I don't know if anyone wants to take an attempt. Someone in Dadaab, if you want to try, maybe someone close to the front, just shout it out. What do you think the explicit curriculum is here in this photo of the prison? What are they teaching?
You ask the thing, what you think is explicit from this one? What is explicit there? Can you explain? What does it teach you immediately that you see?
I see a hand up. Excellent.
Okay, thank you. In the second picture that you see, I say that the laws of the country is to be respected. And once you break the law of the country, you are liable to be arrested and charged for breaking the law. That is explicit curriculum. And in the Eden curriculum, it teaches us to be patriotic and obedient and somebody who is responsible in this country. Are the two curriculums that I can see from the photo. The null, maybe I can say that something which is missing, which is omitted from there is maybe the ideologies of keeping law, follow how a country should be governed. So if one is not taught, then it may not be having those knowledges. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Akiti. Yeah, you touched on a few important points here. You got the explicit curriculum perfectly. You're right. The explicit curriculum here, very obvious, right, in front of our face, is a prison teaches you that there are laws in the country, and if you don't obey these laws, you will be taken away and put into a prison for punishment. Right? The hidden curriculum, you touched on certain good pieces of it too. It's teaching obedience, teaching responsibility. We could perhaps look at this picture and say that it's also teaching certain power dynamics. We could ask who in this picture has power? Who in this picture has power over whom? The prisoner is certainly being taught that he needs to listen to the guards, that he's not allowed to move freely. We can see his hands are tied, he's being held, that he only gets to move with the permission of the guards. And perhaps there's more implicit hidden lessons in there as well about society. How do we deal with people when they misbehave? What is punishment meant to do? I would also say in the null curriculum, you did note some good things. And then if we take Steve's idea that the null curriculum is actually something intentional and a choice that we can make, we can think about, well, what are the forms of punishment that they're using here? And which ones are they choosing to leave out? Right? We can notice in this picture that it's only the criminal and his guards. The victim is not present in the prison. So we can think about how this prison made a choice not to try and heal the relationship between victim and perpetrator. There's no attempt at restoring a sense of community. Healing is not a focus of this prison. We're not thinking, oh, this criminal, perhaps he's hurt, perhaps something happened to him, perhaps we can help him with guidance and elders and medicine. No, the choice was made that the punishment that he deserves is to be locked away and to be put away from others. So we can see here that certain forms of punishment are present and certain forms of dealing with crime have been left out. They're null. They don't exist in this particular prison. Steve, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that as well.
I love it.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming up and doing that. It was incredibly thoughtful, and I love it. Thank you. It's I mean, the invitation we're doing here is to try to, in our course theme, I suppose, of place and learning, is to try to think about the ways in which place starts to structure learning, both in terms of its material, but also in terms of its social and its cultural norms. And we're thinking to try to expose those and try to think about these in terms of this explicit, the implicit, and null. I mean, Roxy, I love it. I mean, I love the way, it's just so fantastically interesting, sort of the example. And, you know, there are those sociologists who would turn around and say, well, one of the problems that we face at the moment is that we always tend to seek to punish individuals, and what isn't in the jail is anything sociological. Society is never put on trial. Individuals are put on trial for their punishment. And so one of the things here is the null curriculum is society in interesting ways. But I guess it offers us a way of talking about these pictures. It offers us a way of talking about education, which seeks to break it up. And this is a classic research strategy. And what we're encouraging you to do is to do that type of activity. What I really love about what we're doing is that we are reading an article, and that's important to think about the article and the moves. But what I love more than just the reading of the article is that we're using the article in order to see things, in order to do an analysis, which the article invites us to think about. We're taking the article with us in our ways of thinking, and it helps to structure our ways of thinking in different ways. So this is less about memorizing the article. This is more about knowing the article and then taking the article and thinking through. Indeed, one of the things about education research, when you get into it, and one of the things I suddenly found out when I was just about sort of, you know, finishing my journey in school, I was doing my doctorate. Suddenly I could see the whole world through the lens of my PhD. There's this and this. And education research offers us that, much of it offers us that possibility. Think of it like a pair of glasses that you put on, and you could look at a classroom. So now you could move into the back of a classroom, and you could think about a classroom in the ways that Eisner thinks about it. You could sit in the back of a classroom and watch a teacher, and you can think about, hang on a moment, what's the explicit, what's the implicit and the null? Remember, Eisner's primary focus is on the implicit and the null. And Eisner thinks these are very, very important. Indeed, actually, what you'll find in education research is that there's an enormous amount of research that goes into the implicit and the null, especially when people turn to questions of culture, questions of anthropology, questions of sociology, questions of structure. They nearly always make the move to the implicit and the null. Whereas those who are interested perhaps in terms of educational outcomes, education and education performance often associate their work with the explicit curriculum. This is what it says it does. Does it do it? These types of ideas. So in Eisner's work, there is really an interesting way of thinking about so much education research, and so much education research starts to either be about the explicit, the implicit, and the null. And I suppose so much of what we're going to be talking about in the tradition of our faculty is about the implicit curriculum. You know, places implicitly teach in particular ways, and that's something that we're going to explore. You can do the same thing with the laboratory, and you can do the same thing with any picture, and you can do the same thing with your classroom. You can do the same thing with a community group. You can do the same thing with our lecture. Here, me and Roxy are on a screen in another country talking about something in English. There are lots of different ways of thinking about this, and that deserve our attention. Sometimes these things are possible to change. Sometimes these things aren't possible to change. And it's not quite as straightforward as we're going to talk about in a moment. regarding what are the benefits and what are the weaknesses. There is that, and we invite you to do that, but we invite you to think about that perhaps in complicated ways so that there are benefits and weaknesses for the implicit curriculum, rather than them being the explicit curriculum is a benefit and the implicit curriculum is a weakness, which sometimes is the way that we talk about. I love it. I love it. Thank you. And forgive me if I'm talking too much. It's an example of the professor on the screen talking too much, colleagues. But it is lovely. And thank you so much for your willingness to come to the camera and talk about this. It's lovely. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think we're going to use the rest of our time together to really unpack this first assignment that you have, which asks you to engage in Eisner and do exactly a similar activity to what we just did, but in written form. So we're going to go through this. I'm just going to hide this here so we can see it. So perhaps, Steve, I'll just run through these logistics.
I love it, Roxy. Thank you.
Great. So this your first assignment in this class is due next week. So it's a tight turnaround, but the idea is that it's a short paper that is going to give us a sense of where you are, how you're absorbing the material, and how we can work together in the rest of the course. So it's a short assignment, just around 800 words. So if you'll remember, one page single space is 500 words. So it's a page and a half. We're asking you to submit it double spaced. So regular font size and 1.5 to 2 spacing. And of course, this assignment is worth 15% of your final grade. And as we explained last week, this is a pass-fail assignment. So if you submit your assignment, you get 15 out of 15. And if you don't submit your assignment, you get 0 out of 15. And then Steve and I and Mark and Ochan, we'll focus on giving comments and feedback about the ideas that you've presented. And as Steve said last week, we will give you a grade to show you what you would have gotten. So you might get your assignment back and it'll say 15 out of 15 because you submitted it, and then you'll see a B+. And that B+ is just telling you that's the quality of the assignment that you submitted. So you understand where you have to improve and where you're doing really well in the assignment. But your grade is, if you hand it in, you get 15 out of 15, and that's for everyone. We also invite you, this is an option, not a requirement, but an option if you choose to do this. You could include a drawing or photograph of the place that you are describing in your assignment. And we ask that you submit your assignment onto Moodle under assignment 1. And you all are very familiar with that process, so I'll leave it there, but just reminding you to upload your assignment to Moodle for next Saturday. And then we can get more into the details about what exactly is this assignment. Perhaps, Steve, I'll hand this back over to you.
Yes, of course you can. I mean, it's a pleasure. I mean, the first assignment is very structured, and we've done this deliberately because because it is the first assignment, and so we really wanted to offer some guidelines for this. And so the crucial thing, of course, is, as you know, as teachers, and I don't need to repeat this, that if you're a set assignment, then it's important to actually do each part of the assignment. And the ways in which we've structured this is to make the successions of questions for part 1, part 2, and part 3 increasingly more difficult. Part 3, I think, is more difficult than part 2, which is more difficult than part 1. The assignment, if you like, goes from more of a descriptive type of analysis to more of an analytical type of analysis, which invites you to engage with your values towards the latter stages. So it's deliberately done like this in order to think through some of the processes involved in in education, and also to think through in your own work how to use description and how to use analysis. And that is something that we're going to play with. Certainly, the key to the assignment is to pick a place and to pick a place of learning and to try to be as specific as you possibly can. One of the things, as you know from Eisner, is that Eisner comes up with lovely examples. And so almost it's asking you to do something slightly more contextualized. I want you to choose one place, a particular place, and then I want you to do a similar type of thing that Eisner does, but I want you to try to be much more specific. Eisner's analysis is of the school. We invite you to analyze a particular school, a particular classroom, a particular university class, a particular community center, a particular museum. Your assignment is much, much more localized than Eisner's. And so that is, I want you to, and that is in its power, because you're able to say things about things you know. Much like sort of the phrase, which is writers write about what they've experienced. Educators, I think, need to write about what they've experienced and how they've experienced it. Make sure you choose something that is close to you, write about that, and don't get lost in writing about Eisner. Use Eisner to look at the thing that you're choosing. So Roxy has so rather beautifully broken it down into a series of phrases. First of all, an assignment needs a very, very sort of short introduction. Remember, you're working with 800 words here, which is a very tight assignment. If you go over 800 words to 1,000 words, Roxy and I are not going to word count. But if you're under 800 words, 600 words, I think you're missing things, because it is a challenge. And certainly one of the challenges here is to try to get around 800 words. It's sometimes much easier to write a long essay than a short essay, and that's something to bear in mind as well. So Roxy's broken it down, and we'll fly through this. The first thing is what you're going to do and how you're going to introduce it. Eisner does really lovely. He uses a lovely phrase, and he uses a quotation from Dewey to introduce his assignment to his essay. Here, I think you might want to do something that's interesting, that captures the reader's attention. And then you need to move into your place and your place of learning that you've selected. You need to say a tiny little bit about this, as well as situate yourself, place yourself in this place. And you might want to, again, the time here, the space here is tiny. You might want to say a little bit about why you chose that place. But mostly your work is descriptive. You're describing the place that you've chosen. The second part responds to this idea of the three curriculum. You can take it on board that Eisner, we know the distances between Eisner's explicit and implicit curriculum. What your role here is to use your example to talk about your example using Eisner's work. So you are analyzing your example by using Eisner and thinking about the explicit, the implicit, and the null. Think of it in those terms. So bringing Eisner to your place and thinking about that place. That's the way to think about it, rather than other ways of thinking about it, which is that you want to try to write about Eisner. You're using Eisner to write about your place. And here you need to make and give examples just in the way that Eisner did, but specific examples from your place about the explicit, the implicit, and the null. So here, the particulars and the specifics matter a lot. Give specific examples as to what you consider to be this explicit, this implicit, and this null. And Roxy is fantastic in her emphasis, because she's emphasized this in each one of those questions she asks. She situates it, or she places it in your place of learning, in your place of learning, in your place of learning. And that's actually the most important thing. For me, the null curriculum, as I explained earlier, comes a little bit alive when I think not only about the content that's missing, but also about the intellectual processes that are missing, much in the same way that Eisner talks about the null curriculum. Similarly, the implicit curriculum, Eisner has an enormous number of examples. And don't be shy about using some of those examples with reference to think about your place. And of course, you might find that some of the examples that Eisner uses don't fit your place, and you may have to come up with others. You don't have to, but you can, and that's the question. The second part is really about this idea of valuing and about what is good and what is not so good. And here we invite you to think about some of the advantages and disadvantages of some of the things you've talked about in part one. My suggestion perhaps is to focus on the implicit or the null curriculum in part one, but you don't have to. You can focus on the others. And then what you're starting to do is to think about, well, what might be advantages and disadvantages? Roxy spoke rather lovely about a particular large lecture theatre. And then the lecture theatre, in a sense, is about the individualizing of learning. It's about a teacher who is set up to convey information over an hour or so. And that has both advantages and disadvantages. I like the "and" in there. It is neither good nor bad. It is good and bad. So if, one example, one of the things that Eisner speaks a lot about or writes a lot about is notions of compliance and the idea of compliance and the ways in which that erodes initiative. When Eisner talks about the implicit curriculum, this is a theme that comes up in his work. Compliance and initiative are not necessarily a polar, a kind of argument where one is good, one is bad. Compliance can be good for some reasons. Compliance can be bad for some reasons. Compliance can be an advantage for some reasons. Compliance can be a disadvantage for some reasons. You make your work academically complicated by making that move. It sounds obvious. I hope it sounds obvious. But honestly, that move really is the key to educational work. Don't get caught into thinking about places as being simple as either an advantage or a disadvantage. There are advantage places, there are disadvantage places. Think about places as being complex and a mixture of lots and lots of different things. And if you make that move, your academic writing will move up, and suddenly it will come across as being incredibly thoughtful, and it will be much more publishable work rather than work which seems to get trapped into this idea of one thing being good and one thing not being good. Complicated is good in education, and you can see that within the context of Eisner, with some reservations. The last part, I suppose, is this tensions and ambiguities piece, which is the hardest part of the assignment. We asked you to think about what you've just done and what Eisner does. What you've just done in part one and part two in the introduction is think about your experiences of education in a particular place in three ways: as explicit, as implicit, and as null. You've broken up a place into a curriculum, and the curriculum is explicit, implicit, and null. The final part asks you to think about what are some of the tensions, the difficulties, the ambiguities associated with breaking educational places up into those three particular areas. What does Eisner invite you to do that in some respects is both a helpful thing, but in other respects, it misses things? In a sort of bizarre way, it invites you to think about the implicit and the null curriculum of the very activity that you've been doing. The activity meaning that you've taken an educational place, your classroom, you've thought about it in these three ways with Eisner, and then you're turning around and thinking, well, I need to think about why what is an advantage of this way of doing it and what is a disadvantage? What is attention and what is ambiguity with this way of doing it? Certainly some of the conversations you've had regarding the explicit and implicit and the null raise questions about how difficult it is to distinguish between these things. And that's worthy of some reflection in this last part of the essay. Why was it difficult to distinguish between the implicit and the null, which was something that Mark highlighted that occurred within your previous discussions? What is it that makes that difficult? And I think if you think about those difficulties, that is some of the tensions and ambiguities come up. There are other examples that I can talk about here, and I think Mark was really rather good at starting to, and Ochan, and you've been rather good at doing this, because you started to think about the perspective that this is written from, and the ways in which this type of analysis is very, very structured. It's focused around a school. The school is the thing that determines everything. It doesn't really allow a lot of space for learners and for teachers. And I wonder whether or not your example, in some respects, might be something that takes place in a school, but doesn't necessarily follow the same rules that Eisner sets out. Eisner's rules are interesting in ways in which he talks about the school, but I like to hold on to the possibilities that there's so much more happening in every one of your classrooms than Eisner says. And the implicit curriculum is both there, but maybe it isn't as implicit as Eisner necessarily makes out. I suppose I also, in an email that I've sent to everybody, breaking down this assignment on Moodle. So if you go into Moodle, there was an email from me and should have received an email from me. I also tend to think that Eisner tends to highlight some things and not other things. Eisner starts to think about the structure of the classroom. He doesn't use any sense of identity politics. He doesn't use ways in which the classroom is gendered, the classroom is racialized, the classroom is ableist, the classroom is colonialized. He doesn't talk about any of those factors. And as Roxy so astutely said earlier, he doesn't really talk about power. He talks about the ways in which schools, in a sense, bring about a certain structure that highlights some things rather than other things. But he doesn't go a stage further and say, well, these things favor some students and don't favor other students. So Eisner takes these conversations in some directions, but doesn't take them in other directions. So the last part, if you like, and I've probably made this far too complicated, and forgive me if I have, the last part is to reflect on what is lost and what is gained, what are tensions and ambiguities with breaking classrooms and various places up into these types of three curriculum. What is lost and gained with this type of educational analysis in which you are seeking to reflect upon your classrooms or other places and break them up into these three areas. What are some of the strengths and weaknesses with that analysis? And I know I've probably spent 3,000 words talking about an 800-word assignment. But I mean, my advice in order to think about this assignment is try to make sure that you write about the assignment and cover part 1, part 2, and part 3. Traditionally, what happens is that everybody covers part 1 and 2, and then part 3 is rather underexplored. Here we invite you to get the highest grade to make sure that you cover the 3 parts. And that's the most important piece. Yeah. Roxy, do you want to?
Oh, I just wanted to let you know
I'm
we're
sorry,
over
we're
time.
Oh, I'm sorry,
Yeah.
colleagues. Forgive me. Oh, yes. Okay. Sorry, Roxy, you should have warned me. But I was enjoying myself. Forgive me.
Yes. No worries. It's good explanation. Very helpful. But I think we should probably call it to a close now.
Yes. Okay. So for next, if we can skip through the slides to the final piece, the final slide, we'll pick up these other pieces, don't worry. So what do you need to do for next week? Well, number 1, you've got to complete that first assignment. Number 2, I really want you to post an introduction up on Moodle. And then there is a reading for you to do next time, which I invite you to do. And I think it will be really interesting as teachers. I'm thanking you again, and I know people have got to go, and I fully recognize that, and forgive my timing. But it's lovely to see you. And please post that introduction, because I want to get to know you, because otherwise it's me and Roxy, and I won't get to see you until I travel out a little bit later this year. But it's so fantastic. So please post the introduction. And Sobel article is very, very approachable and very readable. So you've got a bit to do for next week. Mm-hmm. Assignment, me and Roxy are online. If there's any problems, Mark and Otchan are there to help. Post an introduction, and then also do that reading, which is on Moodle. Roxy, over to you.
Yeah, no, I'll just close it off and say, remember, we have our WhatsApp group. If any questions come up about the assignment, I encourage you to post them there, because if you have a question, I'm sure someone else has the same question. So it's helpful to the whole group if you post your question in WhatsApp, and Mark and Ochan and I will support you through that process. And we look forward to receiving all of your assignments next week.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ochan. Thank you, all of you. It's a pleasure working with you, and I hope that I didn't talk for too long today, and I hope I haven't confused everybody. Forgive me if I have. Look after yourselves. Thank you, Mark. And Mark and Ochan will be in contact, and everybody else, we're on WhatsApp and on Moodle if you wish to connect with us. And Roxy, I'm talking. Forgive me.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Yeah. Okay, we are.